Before we get into this episode, there's something that might be of interest that I wanted to tell you about. Scene and Heard, who run this podcast, have been asked by Scotland Food and Drink to undertake a strategic review of the Scotland Food and Drink Excellence Awards. Now, these Excellence Awards have been going for almost 20 years and are a huge mainstay of the food and drink sector. But it's time to ensure that they're still relevant. So if you have ever been involved in the Scotland Food and Drink Excellence Awards, or even if you've ever had an opinion about them, we would love for you, please, to complete our survey. So if you go to the On Farm Twitter, which is at @on_farm UK, and click the link in the bio, there will be a tab in there that will take you to the survey, and it should only take you a very short while to complete, but we would be enormously grateful.
Hello, welcome to this episode of On Farm. Today we're heading along the banks, the south bank of the River Tay. We can see Dundee on the other side in the distance, and we're heading to meet a man called James Oswald. And James is a farmer, and we're going to find out about that. He's also someone who has majorly diversified into something very different. You might recognise the name James Oswald. Certainly you should do if you're into your crime fiction. I'm not going to say too much more, because let's have a chat with him and let him tell us more about what he does. Now we just need to find the farm, which is just along here, I believe. It's actually quite a stunning bit of countryside now. We're on a side of a steep hill. It almost looks like sand dunes. The road's got blowing sand on it, looking right down onto sort of reed beds and the silvery Tay. So this is going to be quite interesting, because I'm a bit of a fan of this guy's work, and it's quite nice to be able to go and see someone like that for the pod. But I think there's an interesting story too, because he's a farmer and he's writing books, and he's got a very different story to tell for us all. Right, let's see. James, hello.
I'm James Oswald, livestock farmer and author, Sunday Times-bestselling author of 20 novels now. I've got 2 crime series, the Inspector McLean series, which are set in Edinburgh, and the Con Fairchild series, which are set all over the country. And I've also written a 5-book epic fantasy series based on, when I lived in Wales for 10 years, based on the Welsh language and mythology.
James, so delighted to be here. We are the On Farm podcast, On Farm being food, agriculture and rural matters. And I think I can admit to this on the podcast as well. I'm delighted to be here because I'm a fan. So I might have to just get that out of the way quite quickly. But yeah, we're here because you have I think it's a very interesting story to tell from a farming perspective. What led you from farming to best-selling author?
Well, I don't know about best-selling author, but I've always loved writing. It's something I've done as a hobby for years and years. I actually had a comic script published by 2000 AD Comic in 1993, which gives you some idea of how long I've been doing it for. And I didn't grow up on a farm either. My father did grow up on a farm. That farm was up in Easter Ross, up north of Invergordon, and he was going to run the farm. He was all set up to take on the farm, and then for various complicated reasons it had to be sold. So he lost the farm, as it were, and ended up working as a stockbroker, so a different kind of stock, in London for 20 years, which is why I don't sound particularly Scottish, because I grew up in the south of England. But he always wanted to farm. I always remember when we were very small, my brothers and sister and I, every Christmas we'd have our Christmas list of what we wanted to get for Christmas, and we'd have a little book, and there was a page for each of us, and there was a page for my mum and a page for my dad. And Dad always just wrote farm. That was all he ever wrote. Right. He commuted into London. We lived in the countryside. Most of his friends around where we lived were farmers and farm workers and stuff. Those were the people that he mixed with. And then when they had the Big Bang and the deregulation of the city in the mid-80s, he got a big chunk of money from that and bought this place.
And then here you are. Did you come up here at that stage as well?
I moved up with the family. I went to Aberdeen University at much the same time. So I moved as far away from where we lived down near London to go to university, and the parents followed me up. But it was quite handy because Aberdeen's only an hour and a half up the road. So I did a degree in Aberdeen, and then I stayed there for 5 years afterwards. And basically just used to help out, and I'd come down and help with lambing and calving and anything to do with harvest and all that sort of stuff. So just helping out on the farm.
And did your dad very much become a farmer at that stage?
Absolutely. Yeah. He was full on. We had, it was about 500 acres, about 150 acres of good arable land, and we mostly grew malting barley here. And then he had, I think it was about 50 head of suckler cows and followers and stuff, and they ran on all the rougher land, and about 400 ewes. So it was a good commercial farm, and he had one man working with him, but he did most of the work himself.
Because just for our listeners, just to give an idea of where we are geographically, we're on the south bank of the Tay estuary, and the ground rises really steeply up from the water, right up, and James's steading and house is on a sort of shelf halfway up a hillside.
Halfway up.
Yeah, with the hill rising behind and some really, steepish but good-looking arable ground down to the Tay below. So a really good mixed farm back in the day.
It was a very, very good, productive mixed farm. Yeah. Sadly, when my mum and dad very sadly died in a car accident in 2008, which is when I took over the farm. But I've got 2 brothers and a sister, and everything was split 4 ways. So in order to keep as much of the farm as possible, we had to sell most of the arable land. Mm. There's a lovely, lovely arable field just outside the kitchen window here, but that belongs to my neighbour now. When we first came here, we owned the farm, included the land all the way down to the Tay, but not as far up the hill as it does go now. But over the years, my father sold some of the land to the north, with on the banks of the Tay, and bought the hill, basically, Norman's Law. So the farm geographically has moved south, but obviously the farmyard has stayed where it is because you can't pick up the buildings and move them. So now...
But it's climbed in altitude as well.
It's climbed in altitude. Well, we go over the hill and come back down the other side, but all the buildings and everything are right in the northwest corner of the farm, and you can go 2 miles to get to the other side of it. So we're quite spread out.
So staying on farming and things, I'm really keen that we go in to talk about Tony McLean and some of the books and what have you, but staying on farming for a minute, you came back in 2008, as it were. Sounds like tragic circumstances, sorry to hear that, but you came back here and you took on what you could. Your brother, your family, you split it up, but you took on a part of the farm.
Yeah, I took on as much as I could. So basically, we sold, I think it was about 150 acres of arable land, and I kept everything else. Mm-hmm. I've got the steading buildings. Mm-hmm. And my younger brother lives in the old farmhouse, so he got that as his chunk. Mm-hmm. It took a little while to sort everything out, as the way with estates and things. So when Dad died, also he was 72, so he eased back from the full on farming, and he'd rented out. Well, he was in a partnership agreement with the arable land, and he'd rented out some of the grazing, and he had a wether flock, and that was about all the livestock he was doing. So when I took over, there was nothing, no livestock, and I had to start again from scratch.
And you obviously wanted to start again. You wanted to farm.
I'd always wanted to do it slightly differently to the way he was doing it. I mean, what son doesn't want to farm differently to their farmer, to their father? And I wanted Highland cattle because a lot of the land is very rough grazing, and they do work very well there. And also, they're just magnificent beasts. So we established a nucleus fold of pedigree Highland cattle, and I've been slowly building that up over the years. I also, we had a flock of Romney sheep, partly because my partner Barbara is although she's a highly qualified, got a doctorate in animal nutrition and worked for ADAS for a long time, she's also a very keen knitter. So she wanted a wool sheep and a mixed sheep, and the Romneys are very good for that. So we built up a flock of purebred Romneys. But about 4 or 5 years ago, when the books took off, and it was just too much work, it so happened at the same time our neighbouring farm was sold, and the new family who moved in there were looking to rent some extra grazing. Came up here and asked me if I'd got any grazing they could rent, and I said yes. And would you like to buy some sheep too? So they bought all my sheep, and they now rent about 100 acres of the total land.
Is that difficult for you?
No, it's actually it's great because there's not many of the Romneys left now, but yeah, I get to see my old sheep, and I don't have to do lambing. So it works out really well. It means, and we get on with them really well. They're in a really nice family, and if I have to go away to do a book event somewhere, whereas before it was just Barbara was just here, and if something went wrong, she'd have to phone around for help. Now it's just pick up the phone and Andrew will come, and Andrew is the main farmer. His father's there as well. They came down from Caithness, and his father's quite old, but he's very, very knowledgeable. He's always going around keeping an eye on things, which just is a weight off my mind whilst I'm chasing deadlines.
But you've obviously kept the cattle and built the numbers up a bit of the cattle as well.
Yeah, I started off with, I bought 12 pedigree Highlands from Willie Thompson over at Barhead. Okay. He's dead now, very sadly, but he was very big in the Highland Cattle Society, and a bull. And we've now got, I think we're up to about 18 breeding sucklers, and so we keep our replacements and just get a new bull in every 4 or 5 years. It's getting more and more difficult they don't really make any money, the Highlands, I have to admit. We had a box scheme. Our neighbours, again, they were running a box scheme, so we were selling steers to them, and that was working quite well. But the abattoir that did all the meat plant, because they didn't do the killing, but they did all the cutting and sorting out the box scheme, was downfield just outside Cooper, and that closed down about a year ago now. They've been trying to sell it for a long time.
It's so annoying. The number of people that we speak to that are in a similar situation. I tried to do it. I was selling boxed lamb, and it was fine because we had the abattoir at Galashiels, and I took the lambs over there, dropped them off, and the next time I saw them was in a nice cardboard box in the butcher's in Lauder. Because they did all the transport, it was all fine. The Galashiels abattoir closed, and the nearest one after that was Wishaw or Paisley or something, and you had to put them on a lorry, and it just doesn't work.
Same with with the steers. We used not to dock their horns, and we used to take them to Dunblane, and because the abattoir there would take horned beasts. Nowhere else will. So now we have to do them at they'll get done. The last year's calves will come down for weaning, and we'll do their horns then. And I've tried doing various other doing them when they're only a week old or whatever, and it never really works properly. No. But and I hate doing it. I mean, it doesn't hurt them. It's all done with the vet and under anaesthetic and everything, and they're fine once they're done. But they don't look the same.
They're not Highlanders. They're not Highlands.
Yeah.
Yes.
Pause for a
cup of tea. Yeah. Thank you.
It's there's some milk there and some sugar.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. So that's the problem, though, because we're kind of going tangential here, but there are so many people who have had probably what you would call false starts in trying to do like farmers markets or sell direct box scheme as you talked about it, but the facilities and the infrastructure is just not there to support it.
Well, I mean, the other thing that we tried to do with the Romneys was to get because Barbara is very much into her knitting and her yarn and stuff, and we got a whole load of the lamb's wool processed one year with the idea of selling that on. That was about 8-9 years ago. I think we've still got some of it upstairs, and it cost a lot of money to get it processed. It had to be sent down to, I think it's Dorset or Cornwall or somewhere is the nearest place you can get it done, because there's nowhere that will process it on small scales. And it's possible to do it, but it requires an awful lot of upfront capital, basically, and then it's a long time to pay off. So that was, another potential farm diversification, which was stymied by the lack of facilities. But then on the other hand, there's a reason why it's expensive.
Yeah.
It's because it's a long and complicated process.
But then the diversification came along that, what I'm going to say, in terms of diversifications, it must have been quite an easy one to finance, as it were. You didn't need to build a shop. You didn't need to whatever. I guess you bought a laptop or a sharp pencil or what. How did it work?
Well, as I say, I mean, I'd always been writing, and even before I took on the farm, we'd been down in Wales. Barbara she got a PhD in animal nutrition at the Dick Vet in Edinburgh, and then got a job working for ADAS on one of their research farms down in Wales, just outside Aberystwyth. And two of us moved down there in 2000. And I got various odd jobs helping out with research projects and stuff. But I was always writing in my spare moments, because I'd loved doing it. Is
that something you'd just always done from childhood?
From childhood, but most certainly when I was at university. I was obsessed with comics for a long time, and I wanted to try and write comics. So I was writing lots and lots of comic scripts and sending them to 2000 AD and DC and Marvel, and getting lots of rejections back. But I just loved the challenge of taking nothing and turning it into something. So I'd been doing that, and then when I lived in Aberdeen, I was through comics, a mutual love of comics, I was introduced to a chap called Stuart McBride, who anyone who's read crime fiction may have heard of. Back then, obviously, he was not writing crime fiction back then. This was in the early 90s. He and I really got on really well. Used to exchange manuscripts, give each other feedback and stuff. And then he got his big break when HarperCollins published his first novel. He phoned me up and told me to stop writing the nonsense that I was writing at the time and try crime fiction. And I hadn't really written any crime fiction. I mean, it was sort of incidental to some of my comics plots and stuff. But I just thought, well, I'll give it a go. And I hadn't read much crime fiction then. I read a few of Ian Rankin's books because my dad was a big fan. So I kind of modelled myself on Ian Rankin and Stuart's books, which I had read, and came up with the character Tony McLean I'd had for ages. He'd been in some of my comics just as a walk-on policeman. So I thought, well, I'll try writing a few short stories. And I wrote a half a dozen short stories, one of which was Natural Causes, which I then expanded into a full-length novel. And I submitted that was in 2005, 2006, so quite a long time ago now. And I submitted it to the Crime Writers Association Debut Dagger competition, which is a competition for unpublished authors. And it was shortlisted. Oh, brilliant. That's, wow. And I went down to the award ceremony in London and had a great party because Stuart was there as the sort of bright new light and everything, and he introduced me to loads of people. I didn't win, but publishers asked to see the novel on the back of that. I thought, this is brilliant. It's great. So it got sent off. I got an agent, and she sent this off to loads of publishers, and then it started to come back with what I like to call rave rejections, because they were all saying, "Oh, we love that your writing's really, really good, but there's no market for crime novels with a supernatural twist in them. You can't have a whodunit when it turns out to have been a ghost or a demon at the end. That's horror, not crime." And it got turned down for that reason. But by that time, I'd already written the sequel to it because I got so excited about being shortlisted for the Debut Dagger and everything. So I put that in for the Debut Dagger, the Book of Souls, which is book 2 in the series. And it got shortlisted as well. And the publishers asked to see it. And the whole same thing happened, came back. And then I'd got really quite close to getting a publishing deal with one publisher. And July 2008, my parents died. And that just stopped everything dead. I couldn't. They turned the book down. That publisher turned the book down at the last minute. But I had no enthusiasm to do anything for probably a couple of years because You know, it's a big shock.
Yeah.
I was mourning and grieving and stuff. And then I was busy taking on the farm, and I didn't really have time to write anything for a while. But I was still quite keen to publish, and I'd been introduced to the idea of self-publishing on the Kindle, on Amazon ebooks and stuff. And I thought, well, I've got these 2 books that I've already written. I don't have time to write another one at the moment because I'm too busy with the farming. I'll just put them out, see what happens. And I didn't do any marketing or anything. I worked out the best way to format everything and how to make it look professional.
You did all that yourself?
I did all that myself. Yeah. I did commission someone to do covers for me. So I spent, it was about $100 or something for a couple of covers. And I thought, if I make that back, I'm doing well. And if I make a little bit more, it'll pay for some wine at Christmas or something. And natural cause.
You've now got the wine fridge
Yeah,
in your new house you built, so we can hear it in the background there.
Yeah, the wine fridge in the background. Yeah. So I didn't really have any great thoughts about it. And the only marketing thing I thought was I'll make the first one free for a while, so if people can download it for free, and if they like it, they can pay for the second one. Mm-hmm. And if the second one starts selling well, I'll write the third one, because I had ideas for a third one at that point. Within days of Natural Causes going free, it was being downloaded 2,000 times a day. And I think in the end, I shifted about 300,000 copies of it, paid and free, over an 8-month period. And the second book, which I got out, and I was charging £1.99 for it, and it was selling really, really well. And a friend of mine who'd done a bit of ebook publishing said, you're not charging enough for it. So I put it up to $2.99 and the sales doubled. And then I put it up to $3.99 and they doubled again.
People thought they were getting better value. It was a better book, or
it was just, and
that's incredible, because that would be all, without being blunt about it, that'd be all into your pocket, because there's no publishing house or anything involved. That was just you.
And at that price, Amazon takes 30%. So I get 70%, but 70% of £4 is still quite a lot of money, which certainly helps with the feed bill.
It knocks the Romneys and Highlanders into perspective a wee bit. Yeah. At what point did a publisher come to you and say, sorry, James, sorry, Mr. Oswald, we got this wrong. People do like crime fiction with a supernatural twist does work.
Well, this was 2012 that the Natural Causes took off so spectacularly, and I went down that summer to the big crime fiction festival in Harrogate. There's an annual crime fiction festival. I didn't have an agent at that time. My original agent that I'd had before had retired, and I was approached by 2 or 3 agents looking to represent me, which is the opposite way of it normally happening. But there was one who I had met before when she'd only been an agent's assistant, and she'd liked my work, but the agent she was assistant to hadn't, so they hadn't taken me on. But she came up and said, I'm an agent in my own right now, and I ended up signing with her. And she just did her stuff. She went around all the publishing companies and said, told them the story about the book and showed them my Amazon figures. And actually we had 5 or 6 publishing companies bidding against each other for the rights to the book. I got a phone call from her when I was in Dundee doing the shopping one day, and she phoned me up to give me an update and said, such and such a publishing house has offered £100,000 for 3 books. I told them no, because she didn't think that was enough. And I mean, bear in mind, given the amount of money I was making from Amazon at the time, they had to offer me quite a lot of money to give that up. Because if I'm not getting 70% of sales from a publishing house. It's a lot less, but they can sell a lot more books, and they do all the marketing and everything. So it's a different arrangement. But we ended up with I think it was a 5-way auction, and Penguin, Michael Joseph, which is an imprint at Penguin, won that. I was actually up the hill mending a fence because the cows had broken into my brother's woods in a snowstorm. So I'd had to chase them out of the woods, and then was mending the fence. My phone went off in my pocket, and I picked it up, and Juliet told me that the good news. I thought, this is brilliant. Somebody else can mend the fences for me now.
We'll get people to do fencing now.
Pay someone to do that.
What's the origin? Where did it come from? Where did an Edinburgh detective with a supernatural twist, a supernatural nemesis, a supernatural theme behind the crime, where did that come from?
Well, it goes right back to the comics. I loved comics, Superman and Batman and all that sort of stuff, but also 2000 AD, which is the great British sort of weekly comic. And I was been trying to write for that for ages. And one of the stories that I pitched for them in the very early 90s was basically a ghost story based in Edinburgh. And there was this one character that was basically at the start of the story. The main character in the story, who's just a down-and-out busker on Princes Street, gets killed quite violently when a truck goes out of control and crashes into him. And then
which you've done again.
I did in one. I reused it the arc of that story is basically until his body is identified, his ghost is wandering the city, causing all kinds of mayhem. And the only person who can see the ghost or even sort of think that the ghost is there is this one detective character, and all the rest of them can't see him. And that's Tony McLean. And that was the first story that I came up with. 2000 AD didn't use that, and didn't buy that story, probably because it was a bit rubbish, a bit derivative, but the character stayed with me. So when Stuart said to me, write crime fiction, I was thinking, well, I don't even know where to start. Hang on, I've got a detective, but his unique thing is that being able to see just beyond what most people see. So why don't I do it a little bit spooky and that sort of stuff? And I hadn't really taken on board that publishers wouldn't like that at the time. It was just the sort of thing that I wanted to read. Yeah. And the interesting thing is, if you read the blurb in any of my books now, it never mentions any kind of supernatural influence. It might be dark and sinister crimes or nasty things happening, but it won't say specifically, Syrian refugees have brought a jinn across with them, and now it's stalking the streets of Edinburgh, because that would go straight into the horror section, which is like 5% of the crime market. So it doesn't sell as well, which is a shame, because there's great writing, great horror writers there.
So even in your, practicing your art, writing, you're still keeping the cynical farmer businessman hat on here and still making sure that you've got that market.
Well, it's not, I don't get to write the blurbs. If I was doing the blurbs, if I was doing the cover flap stuff, I would probably say, Satanists are doing such and such or whatever. I've always tried to make the books so that stuff is a little bit ambiguous. It could be that there are actually demons, or it could just be that people are being really nasty because they believe in demons. That's kind of the central question behind a lot of the books.
I'll come back to, I'm a fan, I'm a reader, and I do think that some of the books, there's more obviously, I guess, only a supernatural path it could take, if that's the way of putting it. Whereas there's other times where you think, just as you say, it could be that this is just happening because this psycho is influenced, or thinks that that's thinks that that's influencing him. Is that a fair way to put it?
That's how I like to pitch it. There's actually there's a line at the end of Natural Causes, and I think given how long the book's been out, I can probably say this without giving too many spoilers. So I'm rubbish at remembering what is a spoiler or not. But they're having finally identified the young woman, and they're burying her, and McLean's boss says to him, "You don't believe in all this stuff, do you, Tony?" And he says something along those lines, "God, no, but it doesn't really matter whether it exists or not. They believe in it, and that's all that matters."
Because that's quite key to the story too. In that, the reader, I'm never fully up on whether Tony's buying into what's happening, or if he's just sort of being sucked along. He's there to solve the crime. He's there to find out and lock up the baddies, as it were. But he's never quite, which is probably healthy for a cop, because if he was to think, well, it's just supernatural, he maybe wouldn't pursue it to the nth degree.
I like to think of Tony as he's the ultimate pragmatist. And he doesn't really believe in things. He's not a big one for belief. He's one for evidence, as all policemen should be. If it turns out that the only way he can stop this from happening is to accept for the moment that this is the way the things work, and you have to do this to get rid of, is it a demon or is it someone's imagined demon, then he'll do that, and then park the idea as to whether the demon exists or not. So that's how I approach it anyway, and it's quite a tricky one to do. And sometimes it skews far too far into the sort of there is only a supernatural explanation.
So who are you then, James? Are you the sort of believer that there is, there's more out there and there is, or are you the pragmatist that?
I'm very much the show me the evidence kind of guy. Mm-hmm. I'm I would love it if ghosts and UFOs and all this sort of nonsense existed, but I need a bit more proof than these blurry photos that you see and the people wandering around with infrared cameras in haunted houses and things on the telly.
But you obviously have great. I mean, is it fun to write? Is it hard work to write? I mean, what is it?
It's hard work to write, but it's very satisfying. I think the thing I hate writing, but I love having written, I think is the quote. It's really satisfying if you can get that balance right and play the thing just straight down the middle, where people can either decide, oh yes, it is the supernatural, or oh no, it isn't. And that's how I've always approached writing. I start with a very, very small idea and just kind of work away with it. I'm not much of a planner. I'll just sit down and start writing and see where it goes. And that is quite hard work because your brain is constantly trying to think through dozens of different scenarios as you're writing. But it is very satisfying when it comes together.
And you've been very sort of prolific in your hard work because, what did you say, 2012, we're 10 years-ish down the line. Mm-hmm. And what did you say, 15 books?
20 books in total. I'd written Natural Causes, I'd written 5 books that have since subsequently been published before Natural Causes came out. And it came out, the Penguin edition came out in May 2013, so not quite 10 years ago. But my self-published edition came out just over 10 years ago. And I'm a sucker for punishment, really. Basically, been trying for so long to get published that when it finally happened, I just kind of jumped on it and said, "Yeah, I'm going to do this to the best of my ability." And at the time, we hadn't built that. When it first started, we hadn't built the house yet. When I inherited the farm, my brother got the farmhouse. So we had a Dutch barn just across the yard from where the house is now. Which we didn't really need. So I got a static caravan that I bought off a local caravan park, shoved that in the Dutch barn, and I lived in there for 5 years whilst we were building the house. And I wrote probably 5 or 6 novels in the caravan. But Barbara, my other half, she was still working. She'd moved from ADAS to the Welsh Assembly government just before my parents died. And we had a house down in Wales. So she stayed down there to sell the house and to look for a job up here. So for 3 years, I think it was, I was on my own in the caravan. Well, me and the 4 dogs and the 2 cats. Right. So that's what I do. I'd do the farm work during the day, and as it got dark, I'd sometimes remember to feed myself, and mostly just sit down and write until about midnight, and then go to bed and sleep, and get up the next day and do it all over again. And it's more difficult now because I've got this lovely house and I've got telly to watch and Barbara to talk to. And so actually there's more things getting in the way of the writing. But then I was really very focused and selfish about it.
You're like a modern day Walter Scott. This is your Abbotsford.
It's not quite as grand. It's got a better view.
It's got a fantastic view. I think we said that at the front of this pod. The view that you've, especially the way you've designed the windows like that, the view down to the Tays. Fantastic.
Because of the way the farm is set up, this was really the only place on the farm I could build a house. I could get planning permission to build a house. And that's the view. And it is a spectacular view. So you have to build a house to maximise that. So I designed the house around that view. And then sat down and worked out how I was going to pay for it.
Where are you now? Where's the writing? What's happening? What can we look forward to?
I'm currently working on book 13. I'm about 60,000 words in, which is about the first draft. So that's about halfway. And I've just worked out, I think, how it ends. Which for me, that's quite early on for me. Sometimes it takes me until I'm almost finished, and I say, "Oh, that's what's happening."
Is that normal? Is that does Stuart McBride work like that?
Or I think,
as an example,
different authors plan to different extents, and you get people who plan meticulously, and they'll have the whole thing mapped out before they write a single word. And then you have some authors who, like me, just kind of wing it and hope that something works out in the end. I know I've read an interview with Ian Rankin a few years back now, I think, that he doesn't do very much detailed planning. He'll have a broad outline, which may be 2 or 3 pages of A4, but he won't start writing until he's got a title. And I wish I had that luxury. One of the problems with producing the books, I was doing 2 crime books a year for a while, and running the farm and building a house. I was kind of panicking. I just needed to keep writing just to keep up. So I'd just start writing without a title. And then I'd get stuck because I could not think of a title. And my publisher's asking for a title. We need something to go in the catalogues, and we need to start commissioning cover art.
It's a bit like this podcast. We do one out every week. And what are we going to call this week's episode, Dave?
Yeah. It turns out that my editor, my original editor, who is now currently my editor, is a huge fan of the Sisters of Mercy.
Okay.
So that's why one of my books is called The Damage Done.
Yeah.
Another one is called Bury Them Deep. And one of them's called No Time to Cry. These are all Sisters of Mercy songs. So for book 13, I shall probably go and look through the Sisters of Mercy songbook and see if I can come up with a title or a line.
But the whole process of writing and not quite knowing how it ends whilst you're writing, I wonder if actually that is a good thing from the reader's perspective, because from my point of view, there's no satisfaction in getting, a third of a way through a book and thinking, I can see where this is going, I know where it's going. Maybe that's actually quite key, because you've not written it knowing where it's going. Maybe that,
I certainly think it's. I have occasionally seen reviews for some of my books where it's I guessed who done it by page 5. I said, well, that's clever because I didn't. But I don't know. I think some writers who plot meticulously can maintain that mystery, and they can get the twists in exactly the right spot and everything. But my brain doesn't really work that way. Certainly, I think the way I write, not knowing exactly what's going on, particularly in the early stages of the books, I've got some very interesting scenes going on, and I've got no clue how it all adds up. Means that it's very unlikely when you read it that you're going to have an idea what's going to happen. So I think from that point of view, yes,
But then again, when you introduce a repeating character like Mrs. What's her name? Mrs. Safer?
Mrs. Cypher.
Cypher.
Yeah.
Cypher. When you read a book, you can't, Cypher. Mrs. Cypher. I suppose it's almost, page 5 in the book and Mrs. Cypher appears. She's going to be there or thereabouts involved.
Yeah. Mm. And that is the problem with series fiction, obviously, particularly if you keep on bringing back the same villains. She's a great one, though, Mrs. Cypher, because she also comes from the comics that I've written using Tony McLean as Jane Louise D and as Mrs. Cypher. And a little pun that I've done for myself in the books. She's either always Jane Louise D or Mrs. Cypher. She's never Jane Louise Cypher, but she is Louise Cypher or Lucifer.
This is quite
My editor Alex didn't get that until I think the last book, and I pointed it out to him as well. So it's a little pun, because she is based in the comic script that I wrote. The character Jane Louise D was a young tech, genius, but had no money or no prospects or anything, and basically sold herself to the devil to get fame and fortune and turn herself into what was then because this was right in the early 1990s, so she was the Scottish equivalent of Bill Gates, and that was why she became Lucifer, because the devil basically took her over, as it were. And in the comics, there was no hiding the ghosts and demons and stuff going on. It was because you can get away with that kind of stuff in comics. But that I just kept it as that kind of named thing. And she does seem to have possibly psychic powers. She seems to die, and then maybe it wasn't her, it was a body double, or she's just back or whatever. So that's why, I've always, when I'm writing her, I'm always thinking she is the devil incarnate.
And she originates in this neck of the woods. Is that right? Is it Fife?
No, she had a house. I'm always searching my memory as much as anything for locations, and she had I actually kind of, that was whatever they call it. Writing back, I invented more of her character for one of the later books. I think it was which book was it? Written in Bones, I think.
The one where the politician was shot, was it not?
Yeah. That one. The house the politician lives in is basically the other side of the hill here.
Yes, right. So that was here.
That was here. But Mrs. Cypher, Jane Louise Dee, comes from a family that had a mansion house in the south, in the East Nuke,
yes, right.
and which is close to. Actually, it's a house that my sister and some friends of hers rented when they were all students at St Andrews in the very early 80s. The lovely modernist concrete construction with big glass windows, all looking south to across the Forth, and that became. I used that memory of that house as a setting. Right. And then there's a big mansion house. Well, it was built in the grounds of a big mansion house. And I thought, well, the bigger mansion house can belong to Jane Louise Dee.
It's interesting because, I guess as a farmer, and back to the fact this is the On Farm podcast, by the way, listeners, we are still on farm. There's a real, I'm an avid Ian Rankin Rebus fan. And there's a real feeling of, and I don't know if Ian Rankin listens to this podcast, by the way, but there's a real feeling of almost, I'll be careful how I phrase this then, but there's a real feeling of almost slightly feeling let down if Rebus steps, not out with Edinburgh, because I know that he's done that a lot now, but into the countryside, he's not familiar. But then he wouldn't be. So when a reader reads something and it just, do you know what I mean? It jars because, that wouldn't be what was happening in the countryside at that time of year or whatever it might be. It's like the famous in Superman when the combines and look at the wild oats in that barley. It's the things that jar from a farming point of view or a countryside point of view. But Tony naturally goes into the countryside. It feels more natural. That scene, there's the Highland cattle round about him, felt more, to me anyway, it felt that was,
I think that, I'm probably, I would worry the other way round, that I'm not getting Edinburgh right, because I have very briefly lived in...
Which I was just about to ask. Yeah, does the opposite... Yeah.
I very briefly lived in Edinburgh, in Tony's flat in Newington, for instance. I based on the flat that I lived in Edinburgh when I was a postgrad student for one term before I gave up that course. And I lived in Roslin for 5 years, whilst my partner was doing a PhD at the Dick Vet. And I used to work in a call centre just off Leith Walk. And I worked for a little while in an office in the Grassmarket. So
you have got the geography, yeah.
But a lot of the, particularly in the early books, a lot of the murders took place in places where I had worked because I knew them well enough to be able to describe them. I wrote the first two books.
That's a bad admission, James. You can't say a lot of murders took place where I worked.
Oh no, I'm a crime writer. I've got my cast iron excuse for my browser history.
Brilliant. It's just been great to chat. Absolutely brilliant to chat with James, and we're going to have a bit wander outside and see some Highland cattle and continue our chat, and we'll hopefully bring you that episode next week. I'm already looking forward hugely to next week's episode, when we're going to be back with James Oswald, taking a wander around the farm and the steading and meeting some Highland cattle. Huge thanks again to James for taking the time to chat. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I am a fan, and I'm sure that came across in the podcast, and I can't recommend highly enough, especially the Tony McLean DI Inspector McLean series. I must also big thank you, as always, to our on-farm sponsors, Scottish law firm Gillespie McAndrew. It's sponsors like Gillespie McAndrew who make these episodes possible. And just before we go, our usual reminder, On Farm is made by our team here at Scene&HerdPR and Marketing. Get in touch with us anytime you have any food or rural business, PR or comms questions. So that's it from me, and bye for now.